Hey you beautiful people! Now that we have finished up the Hetzer, it is time to train the crew for it. At least I hope they had training, since in the current post they are more focused on winning a game of scat or playing with a puppy. Now, before I start, I want to warn you that I'm clearly not a professional in any kind of figure painting, and the results will certainly mirror that statement. But let us get into the deep end of it. I took the liberty to assemble the figures off screen, since there's nothing really interesting in it. The only secret move I can tell you is to use pigmented superglue and superglue debonder to fill in the gaps of the plastic parts. Otherwise, everything is standard procedure, even by AFV modelers standards. The next step is to prime these gentlemen. Since I'm too lazy to buy a new can of Tamiya primer, I simply used AK Real Color paints. It doesn't really matter for plastic figures in my opinion, as the details aren't as sharp as resin ones. The base tone is a German chocolate brown for the dark parts. The highlight is ivory white, and in hindsight I could have used the colors of the uniform as well and would be done with the clothes, but I'm a sucker for mediocre figure painting. My plan was to follow Night Shift's glazing method, but it all went under after the first black coat. The thing is, glazing seems to only work with colors, and realistically, black is not a color at all. It does let the base tone see through, however not in a manner that's adequate for a black uniform. All's not lost, since I can still use the highlighted parts for cheating, since they are still barely visible and provide insight on where the uniform should be highlighted. Anyways, it's still a good idea to dilute the paints as much as possible to create even layers and not clog up the detail on the figures. 3 or 4 layers of black was enough for me to achieve a decent coverage and still have some highlights visible. Since the glazing method is a no-go here, I decided to go on with the traditional approach and started painting the highlights with the number 1 brush. I mixed a small amount of Vallejo's Stonewall Grey to the black and simply touched up the parts that still show some of the airbrushed highlights. For the insignia details, I mixed a faint pink from Bloody Red and Dead White. I tried to be really careful not to touch any spots that should stay black. It's best to use a brush with long hairs so the paint won't dry up immediately, and a few drops of paint retarder also helps a lot. For the next step I paint up the metallic parts of the insignia. However, I totally abandoned the idea of precise application and only touched the spots with the tip of the brush. Details are not the sharpest anyways, and from a normal viewing distance it's totally okay. The skin parts are always the part where the figure needs the most love, since we as humans are really good at identifying faces. Which sucks for figure painting because it has to look realistic, or else the whole figure just looks janky. I laid down the first layer, which is AK's light flash. I then painted on a layer of AK's cheekbone glaze. This improves the contrast and makes the raised parts stand out. You can consider this as sort of a pinwash for the face, only more subtle. The glaze is also the foundation for the highlighting. At least it tells me where the highest raised parts should be painted. This is then done with a layer of AK's highlight flash. Just be careful not to overdo the glaze, as the face will look like he got some sort of viral infection going on. The box contains 1 crew member in full uniform and 3 members with only shirts on. So I'm also showing you how I tackled the grey shirts. The same steps apply, the only difference is that I used lighter colors, in this case Vallejo's Game Colors Stonewall Grey. I then gave the chap a layer of neon oil to create shadows on the grey shirt. I carefully removed excess from his back with a wet brush, since that should be a highlighted part. The hair is done by glazing Beastie Brown, being really careful not to touch more than needed. A darker wash can be added to further create contrast, but for this figure I think the Beastie Brown glaze is alright. I also gave the small dog a quick base coat of Beastie Brown, mixed with a small amount of black. This time I gave the puppy highlights to not make it look like a brown blob. All that's left was to paint the cards, but a simple white front with some black and red spots was enough. The gents are all painted up and ready to be placed on the diorama. Honestly, this was my first serious try at painting military figures, and I kind of like how they turned out. Okay, they may not be award winner material, but certainly good enough for me. I will try to get a hold of resin figures. I've been told they paint up easily, and the detail I saw on some of them looks hyper realistic. If you like this video, write to us and look up our other stuff on the shown outlets. Thanks for watching and keep us in your sights.